Chapter 10 Darkness and a feeling of eternity, then warmth and pressure and then light. My emotions are overwhelming and I don't try to stop them, crying as a woman pulls me away. Unlike last time, the worried voices do not stop and people are rushing around in confusion. My first surprise didn't make much of a dent in my emotions. It was hard to care about the screen in front of me. Congratulations, you are now a level 1 Imperial Princess. You have learned the skill Imperial Decree. Even if I had cared all that much, I wasn't given much time to do so, as I was hastily put into my new mother's arms. She didn't look well. Her face was pale and her arms were shaking, and I suddenly had a terrible feeling. She was trying to smile at me, and I was sane enough to try and hug her, to try and comfort her, because I had an idea of what was going to happen. She held me and I held on to her even as I thought, I am sorry, I should have never been born. He made her. She says, stroking my head with a shaking hand, and then she seems to slowly fall asleep. I am not so naive as to believe that though my mother is dead. All I could do was cry. Asterisk. I think my grief was worse this time around, although it is hard to compare them, but there is something exceptionally painful in knowing that my second life had been worse than my first. With mother already dead giving birth to me, my third life was shaping up to be worse still. My worries, long forgotten, that this was some kind of hellish afterlife had returned, and I was terrified that this would be an endless loop of suffering where I could do nothing to end it. My new life was strange as well. I had a wet nurse and there were servants who took care of me and worked to teach me to walk and talk, but I don't think I ever saw father for the first few years of my life. My rooms, which I was too small to leave very much yet, were richly decorated and obviously part of a palace, but I wouldn't describe them as comfortable. Everything was made of stone which had been painstakingly carved with decorations and painted, but all there were for rugs or bedding was thin linen. So everything was beautiful, but hard. It didn't help that nobody gave me any clothes. I had jewelry, golden necklaces, bracelets, anklets, and armlets, adorned with rubies and sapphires, but not a single thread to my name. The very first question I asked in this new language was why they had clothes but I did not, and I was told I was too young and had to wait until I was 6. Not that I was all that different than anyone around me, because no one wore all that much. Not because they were perverts or anything, but because it was unacceptably hot basically all the time. I learned I was in the Rasharan Empire, which translated roughly to streams through the sun's land. It was a civilization in much the same kind of place as Egypt, stretching along a great river that wound throughout an otherwise inhospitable desert. Men wore little more than a linen skirt most of the time, and women a linen dress, and no one wore shoes. You could tell the class, but not the class, of the people around you by their jewelry and the color of their clothes, with bleached white being reserved for some of the higher classes. In the distance, I had seen slaves working, and they had worn nothing at all. Those thoughts distracted me from my misery, but I always came back around to it. I had servants and tutors and guards, but at the end of the day, I was alone. I had half-brothers and sisters, and more than a few because our father had a harem, but I had little in common with the younger ones, and the older ones viewed me as competition. So I was alone, surrounded by people. At least it gave me time to think. Most of that thinking was just self-pity, but I started to get a handle on myself after 4 years of self-loathing and depression. I was 5 years old when the realization hit me like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. Of course, it was my fault that my previous life had been so painful. How much effort did I really put into it? I didn't leave my home for 10 years, and after that I had done nothing but drift through the years as a maid. Oh, I certainly had purpose, but it was nothing that couldn't have been provided by anyone else. I had occasionally had conversations with Kat where I brought up ideas from my world and time, but did I ever bother to put pen to paper and try to spread concepts that could benefit people? No, I didn't. Did I ever try to invest, or get Kat to invest, in research towards technology I knew could exist? No, I didn't. Did I ever even try to improve the health and safety of my family by teaching hygiene practices I had learned from a more scientific world? No, I didn't. I could have shifted that world's course and improved it for the better, and I simply didn't. I should have remembered the dangers associated with medieval history, because when you take out the classes and the skills, the death of my family and myself was utterly predictable. Even if I couldn't know the exact cause, I should have known about all the dangers lurking in the shadows. If I wanted my misery to change, I had to change, and I had to do it soon. Asterisk. Princess Hemmer, a servant, called out from behind me as I strode forth. Please, wait. For what? My mind is set on this. I didn't stop working, but they still caught up easily because my 6-year-old legs weren't that long. I see no reason I shouldn't gain the scribe class. It is beneath your station. The servant tries to explain, but he cannot stop me. If he were to lay hands on me, he would lose them soon after. It is a punishment I personally find atrocious, but that is the least terrible option I could choose. My siblings would likely have him executed instead. More mercy than that was not an option because it was father's decree, and in Rasharon his words were inviolate. You can already read and write, princess, he protests. What need have you for a lesser class? I have no interest in competing with my siblings for the throne, I reply, exiting the cool shade of the palace complex and stepping out into the harsh sunlight that bathes the city share. Undoubtedly, one of my brothers will claim it, and any rival still alive will be purged at that time. The servant sputters as I say that. It certainly is true, but it isn't the kind of thing you are supposed to say out loud. Palace intrigue hides behind euphemism, with the losers retiring to an oasis or sadly returning to the gods of natural causes. Well, the last one is certainly true, as a dagger through the heart naturally ends one's life. The scriptorium is just across the plaza from the palace. It was a busy place, as the main temple complexes were also here as well. While the public couldn't enter the palace, they could enter the plaza and visit the temples, and the area was crowded. And yet, I had no fear of being trampled or of being kidnapped. Where I walked, the crowd split for me. Men and women bowed or kneeled or prostrated themselves as I passed, because they believed I was descended from the gods and that the blood of the divine flowed in my veins. It was a bitter amusement that I was more in danger from my own family than I from even the most criminal element of the lower classes. The commotion I caused was noticed, and there was a head scribe at the entrance to the scriptorium awaiting me. His many bracelets were stained with ink, and so was the linen skirt he wore, a sign that I had interrupted him at work, but that was always going to happen. The business of an empire never ceased. Princess Hemmer, he said as he knelt down, as much to be eye level with me as to show respect to my station. I greet you and ask that Immer and Theo bless you this day. In Emmer's name and by his blood I bless you, I reply, offering him respect in turn with a response that gave him honor by calling my line's patron, the king of the gods and god of the sun, Immer, attention to him. May his light ever illuminate the shadows and his wrath never strike you down, head scribe Gypt. Rise, please, and let us discuss in the shade. The scriptorium is less decorated than the palace, but it is no less intricately carved. The difference between the two is that the palace is decorated with art for the pleasure of the viewer, and the walls of the scriptorium are covered in writing. Stories, myths, legends, and history fill the halls here, although it can be difficult to tell which is which when it comes down to it. After all, this is a world where priests can actually call on the gods and be answered, and where monsters prowl the desert and prey upon unwary travelers and unprepared towns alike. We were seated in a garden courtyard, meticulously maintained by gardeners so that it was lush and green even in the brutal heat of the summer. Servants brought chilled drinks in cups of gold and ivory. Wine, well watered in my case. Scribes were part of the upper class of society, equal to warriors and below only the priests and the royal family. I was grateful for the drink. The heat of this land was unlike anything I had known in either of my other lives. Even the cool, white linen dress I wore seemed oppressive during the day, although I blamed not being allowed to have clothes for years for that feeling. I was quite thankful that my skin was not pale like before, but an olive bronze that resisted burning much better than my previous bodies. I was less thankful for my black hair, despite how excellent the straight black hair looked with gold bands and rubies woven into it. It was hot as hell in the sun. Why did men get to shave their heads? Lucky bastards. I won't take up much of your valuable time, Jet. There isn't a table between us, so I hand off the drink to a servant to hold for me as I speak. I wish to gain the scribe class, and as soon as possible. You will help me in this. Watching Jet bow and acquiesce to my request, I thought that I could understand why nobility lasted so long. A girl could get used to this kind of power. Asterisk. This world wasn't like the one before it. Now there is an obvious statement. Next I might start thinking that the ocean was different from land, or some other outlandish insanity. The differences in the system were major though, and it changed things greatly. In the previous world, it was only possible to have one class at a time, and you had to be awakened to it at age 10. In this world you could have multiple classes at the same time, and not only could they evolve like they could in my previous world, they could also consolidate. A warrior, for example, might evolve into a spearman, and that spearman might evolve into an elite spearman or a veteran spearman or something else. However, if that spearman was also a dancer, his two classes might combine into a spear dancer. Still, few people had the time or resources to gain and level multiple classes. They had work to do, after all. The priests were the only group that reliably could get consolidated classes, and it was still less than a third of them. The royal family was, of course, too busy leveling their main class to worry about consolidation much. After all, how could combining an imperial class with a lesser one improve it? I found this short-sighted and foolish, and as a 6-year-old imperial princess, I had both time and resources on my side. Asterisk. Princess. Singing is for servants. You need not lower yourself to entertain your lessers by becoming a singer. Asterisk. Dancer? But such a thing is not even a religious dance honoring the gods. Princess Hemmer, please listen to reason and reconsider. Asterisk. Princess, forgive me, but you aren't even tall enough to use that harp yet. Even if it was proper, you literally can't become a musician right now. What do you mean, order a stool from the carpenters? Asterisk. 4 years later, I met my father for the first time. I had seen him before now, at official functions and religious ceremonies, but I had never met him personally until he summoned me. At 10 years old, I met what I suppose I would call the Pharaoh of Rasharan, entering the throne room and kneeling down before him. Even as an imperial princess, I was not allowed to meet father's eyes. Instead, I kept my gaze on the floor as the silence stretched on. For a few minutes, you could hear a pin drop in the throne room and anxiety started to grow in my chest. Then, the Pharaoh sighed. My daughter, his voice was powerful. The air shook when he spoke. His level was high, and his class was very powerful. I have to confess that I do not understand you. My other children, I know their desires despite how they think to hide them from me. My empire is well served by letting my progeny compete so that the best may rise to take my place when Emmer calls me to the afterlife. I kept silent. He had not invited me to speak, nor to stand, so I simply kept my gaze to the floor and my mouth shut. I was honestly afraid of father, because he was less of a father to me and more of a pharaoh. Calling him Pharaoh it felt more right than calling him Dad. You, on the other hand, he spoke again, the power of his voice causing me to shake where I knelt in front of him. You started moving, and with purpose, so young. You act like you have a vision of where you will end up, and yet your choices seem random or at least unsuited to rule. Why have you chosen the classes you have? I swallowed, my throat dry, and did my best not to stumble over my reply. Great Father, I have no desire to rule, I answer, hoping that the servants listening and my more ambitious siblings will relay it back to them. And yet, I know my duty as one of the blood of Emmer, My duty to your empire. I seek to enlighten your subjects as Emmer lights up the suns, and the classes I have taken are in service to this. You are so arrogant as to believe that at a mere 10 years of age, that you can enlighten anyone? The wisdom of Rasharan is ancient, child. What do you think you can bring to it? My soul sometimes feels older than my body, great father. I hope he doesn't have me executed, not as I am getting so close to starting. Please, watch me, and I hope you will be impressed. We shall see. Asterisk. The paper of Rasharan was crude. Most writing took place on a papyrus-like reader on tablets of clay. Paper was not nearly so common as either of those, although that was partially because it had not been invented all that long ago. I had been 8 years old when I had surreptitiously sold a piece of my jewelry and funded research into paper. I didn't know enough to make it easy on them, but I also didn't exactly mind if it took a lot of time. I had tons of jewelry of different kinds, possibly literally, and even a single piece of it was worth more than the average worker's entire family. That single bracelet I sold at 8 would fund work for decades. It was 3 years later that I was able to present paper to the scriptorium, and the moment was worth the wait. Already, I had done more to improve the people around me than I had in my previous past 2 lives combined. Admittedly, it would be a long time before paper found its way to the common man, but I knew with certainty that it would and that I had accelerated that process. I had kept up my studies of the arts over the years as well, and I had my first class consolidation at only 12 years old, giving evidence to a theory I had been working on about how class consolidation worked. My singer, dancer, and musician classes combined into the muse class. My theory on how class consolidation functioned became my first paper, although I actually wrote that one on clay tablets to preserve it. Unfortunately, Father was less than pleased at my insistence that it be shared with the whole empire, lower classes included. My theory was, essentially, that class consolidation was the result of intentional overlap. It wasn't just that 2 or more classes could overlap, but that you wanted them to and use them in conjunction. It sounds obvious, I know, but if I could test it I might have been able to prove that any 2 classes could consolidate. But Father had my notes taken and restricted to everyone but priests and the royal family. He also took my work on researching skill combinations, forbidding me from sharing them as I wanted to. I asked him, begged really, for him to share them with our soldiers, but was refused in that as well, despite the growing danger of monsters wandering in from the desert. It wasn't completely pointless though, as my scribe class advanced to scholar by the time I was 13. Advancing 1 class and consolidating 3 others would have made me threatening to my siblings, but my choice of classes, and the fact that I hadn't advanced or consolidated my imperial princess class helped to ameliorate that. Which was just fine with me, as I wanted nothing to do with their bloody intrigue or fighting in general. In fact, I spent much of my time arguing for peace. To the south and west was nothing but desert, and the east was nothing but sand until the coast, but the northeast, along the northern coast, there was a stretch of land between the 2 bodies of water that connected us to another continent. There, the Rasharan Empire bordered the Hittite Empire and the conflict was unceasing, if usually restricted to small skirmishes. Neither side could really win, after all. The Hittite had qualitatively superior soldiers and warriors, but our empire had the desert on our side. So neither side was able to push into the other's territory. And of course, I knew it wouldn't matter if we did. An ancient civilization, still using bronze of all things, would not be able to maintain the level of communication needed to manage an empire much larger than we were right now. We would expand, and then contract or collapse. It would be far better to maintain our size and improve ourselves in defense and social stability. Still, when I learned why the Hittite had such superior soldiers, there were more than just practical or moral concerns that drove my efforts. There was fear as well, because east of the Hittite, between them and another empire whose name I did not know, were the chasms of hell. A name that I would have dismissed as hyperbole in my original world took on a new meaning here in a world with monsters. The chasms of hell spawned monsters, or at least the monsters crawled up from them. They were a series of canyons, miles long and whose depths were shrouded in mist, from which monsters of all kinds would climb out of and terrorize the countryside of the hentai. The hentai empire, of course, garrisoned the areas, but monsters still slipped through. It had been a long time since we had tamed the Rasharan Empire's land. The desert was our shield, and while monsters did wander in from it, it was very few. So I pushed for peace, because I realized that if the hentai empire collapsed, there would be a disaster in the east as the monsters spread unchecked. I did not realize where my efforts would lead me when I turned 16. Character menu, name, Hattie Emery Henry age, 16. Class list, Imperial Princess, LVL 9, Muse, LVL 14, Scholar, LVL 11. Statistics, Strength, 87. Endurance, 92. Vitality, 103. Agility, 162. Dexterity, 130. Perception, 99. Acuity, 142. Willpower, 111. Charisma, 204. Magic, 72. Luck, 103. Abilities: Incarnator Tab, Hidden, First Words, Incarnator Skill, Hidden, Better First Impression, Incarnator Skill, Hidden, Skills, Imperial Decree, Eyes of the Empire, Loud and Clear, Perfect Pitch, Inspiring Voice, Improved Footwork, Find the Rhythm, Dancer's Grace, Always in Tune. Instrument of Bliss, Artisan Experience, Muse's Inspiration, Magic Stylus, Better Paper, Everything is a Record, Scholar's Eye. Imperial Decree, your voice carries the command of your station. Any commands you give or demands you make are harder for the target to refuse. This skill is heavily affected by your charisma stat. Eyes of the Empire, you can immediately see and recognize those who attempt to harm you or your empire. This skill is heavily affected by your perception and acuity stats. Loud and Clear, you can project your voice over a great distance and be heard clearly even in loud environments. Perfect Pitch, you have a supernatural ear for pitch and instinctively sing in tune. Inspiring Voice, your voice, especially when singing, inspires emotions in your audience depending on what you desire to inspire. This skill is affected by your magic stat and heavily affected by your charisma stat. Improved Footwork, you have improved balance and instinctively know where to place your feet while moving, fighting, and dancing. This skill is affected by your agility, dexterity, perception, and acuity stats. Find the Rhythm, you can instinctively sync your movements to the rhythm of music or combat, even predicting sudden shifts in tempo. This skill is heavily affected by your perception, agility, dexterity, and acuity stats. Dancer's Grace, when dancing, your agility, dexterity, and charisma stats are massively increased. Always in Tune, any instrument you use will automatically be tuned correctly. Instrument of Bliss, any instrument you play has a smoother tone and is easier to listen to for your audience. Artisan Experience, when combining artistic styles, singing, dancing, instrumentation, etc., it is easier to use them together and the relevant skills have improved efficacy. This skill is affected by all of your stats, and heavily affected by your agility and acuity. Muse's Inspiration, you can charge your art with emotion and your art will share that emotion with the audience when experienced. Those who view your art are more likely to have a feeling of awe and other artists may become inspired by your work, boosting their acuity and dexterity temporarily. The stronger the emotion used to charge this, the greater the effect. This skill is heavily affected by your charisma, willpower, and magic stats. Magic Stylus, you can summon a stylus to write with. You can also create ink to use when writing on certain materials. Better Paper, paper you write on becomes stronger and more difficult to damage. This skill is heavily affected by your magic stat. Everything is a Record, every day you can store your memories of the last 24 hours perfectly by meditating. Stored memories can be recalled after a short amount of meditation. This skill is heavily affected by your acuity and willpower stats. Scholar's eye. You are able to examine any object you can see and obtain information about it. The amount of information you can obtain is dependent on your personal knowledge as well as your class quality and level. This skill is heavily affected by your perception, acuity, magic, and luck stats. Chapter 11. It is you who has pushed this so forcefully, Father said as he looked down on me from where he reclined on his throne while servants fanned him. So it is you who will carry the burden of arranging it, Hammer. To think I had once thought you to be without ambition, I suppose that shows that not even a descendant of the gods is above being confounded by their daughters. You have 30 official children and Poti only knows how many unofficial ones, I thought to myself. Perhaps you would be less confounded by me if you actually spent time with me longer than the occasional glimpse at some feast or another. Of course, the words out of my mouth were quite different from my inner thoughts. Father wasn't close to me, and as much as that hurt, and it did, the older I became and the more alone I felt, it also meant that he wouldn't be too pained by having my head chopped off for disrespect. Well, as a royal I wouldn't be executed in such a barbaric manner. I would be given the option to ingest poison or my hand would be forced into a jar with a poisonous snake that would bite me. If I had to choose, I would take option 1, but I'd rather not have to choose. Of course, Great Father, I was kneeling before him as was usual when I was summoned. Only the first prince, the second prince, and first princess were allowed to stand. All three were here actually, standing beneath the throne with various amused or calculating expressions. I will devote myself to this and our empire will prosper as a result. It remains to be seen. His humor was gone. His face, impassive. You are dismissed. Go, and make certain to showcase the glory of my lands and name. I bowed low and left, hiding my face lest anyone see that my jaw was stiff and I was nearly grinding my teeth in frustration. Glory. This empire was a static thing, thousands of years old and mostly unchanged in all that time. The river which gave our lands life in the desert, so regular and predictable, made our lives too easy while the desert limited our resources. Innovation was nearly non-existent, there simply was no reason to do so and the caste system made it unlikely to occur. The lower classes were too restricted and the upper classes were bound by tradition and paranoia. Sir, I called to my two most trusted personal attendants, while they would absolutely take bribes to tell my brothers and sisters about my actions, they at least had not been explicitly hired to spy on me. That was not just a moral consideration, but a practical one because it meant that they probably didn't have the spy class. Princess, the two hurried over from where they had been waiting outside the throne room, bowing and quickly falling in behind me as I walked away. How might we serve? I didn't answer immediately, merely fumed for a few seconds as I considered what I would need to make this happen. The benefits of this were obvious, and yet it had been dumped in my lap. True, I had proposed it, pushed for it even, but I was among the least of my siblings in power amongst my father's court. Actually doing what would be required would be difficult for me, and my siblings would almost certainly interfere. This is going to be a pain in the ass, I groaned in a not very princess-like manner as I considered the work ahead of me. We will be preparing the reception for the first prince of the Hentai Empire, who has come to negotiate a peace treaty. My powerful and great father, long may he reign in the sun's glory, has decreed that I shall be responsible for the prince's entire visit to our empire. I would need to have a lot more servants, cooks, and attendants as a matter of course. It would not do for the prince to feel slighted in any way, he would have to be attended at all times. Fuck, he obviously needed a place to stay and I couldn't just throw him in a random room. The palace complex was large, but I would need to find a place that fulfilled father's requirement to show the glory of his empire, and every place like that was claimed by my siblings. I would probably end up having to beg one of my elder brothers or sisters, undoubtedly requiring me to promise them something in return. My carefully crafted neutrality in the court would be shattered. Wait, it wouldn't be enough to arrange things here, the prince had to get here first. I had 6 weeks before the prince would visit, and that would be a hellishly short amount of time to plan and arrange his travel and itinerary. He should be met at the border by someone important, preferably one of the royal family. Well, there is no use pretending that it will be anyone other than myself doing that. It is probably for the best though. I will have more time to sell my ideas to him as we travel. Pack my wardrobe and order the harbor master to prepare the fastest ship north for me. I order the 2 servants. I am going to Algeria. I can't entrust this to anyone other than myself. I will work my way backward from where the prince will enter the country all the way back to the palace itself, preparing every step of the way so that not even a grain of sand will be out of place. It might have been many years, 2 entire lives, since I last took a world history class, but I certainly remembered that a true and lasting peace between empires was a historic event if it lasted for any length of time. Poti help me, I would bring peace to this area of this world for decades if not centuries if I pulled this off. I couldn't let myself fail. *****. 2 hours later, with the royal standard proudly displayed on the ship's prow, I was moving north as fast as possible. Which was actually pretty damn fast and was a demonstration of exactly what the right classes could do when consolidated properly. The ship's captain was a river master and the ship wasn't moved by wind or oar, but rather pulled by 2 giant monsters who swam upriver with ease. While it was true that Sharon had few monsters on land because of the punishing environment, it was a different story in the water. We called the river Sharon, which roughly meant the river of life, and its predictable flooding was much like the Nile. Unlike the Nile, however, Sharon had much worse things in it than mere crocodiles. One of the most feared kinds of monsters in the river were the horrendous scale eaters. I thought they looked like 6-legged crocodiles with tails twice as long as their own bodies. Well, they looked like crocodiles if you increased the size of crocodiles by 6 times or so and then gave them jaws that could unhinge and added 2 more eyes on the back of their heads as well. They were capable of swallowing a person whole, but they rarely did that. Mostly because when hunting on land they usually struck first with their tails, and their tails were powerful enough to bisect pretty much anything they hit. They were worse in the water, as that same powerful tail could push them through the water brutally fast. When they inevitably caught up to whatever they wanted to eat, their jaws would snap open so fast that they would push the water out of the way faster than it could fill the space, forming a massive cavitation bubble between their jaws. The bubble would collapse, which was devastating by itself, producing both light and heat and stunning whatever was unfortunate enough to be hunted by the monster, and then the jaws would snap shut again. When scale eaters hunt, the collapse of the cavitation bubble is easily audible from land and smart individuals stayed away from the water when they heard it. Obviously, the Empire had a way to handle this. Sharon was the main artery of the Empire, and without the river the Empire would collapse. Its utility in moving goods and troops was the backbone of our entire system. The answer to this was the Beastmaster class. Specially trained Beastmasters could gain a skill that would scare monsters away, and their presence on ships and in harbors made the river safe for fishermen and merchants. This ship's captain was originally a Beastmaster and eventually came to be a river captain on his ship as well. Years later, the classes consolidated into River Master and he went from merely scaring away the scale eaters to harnessing them to pull his boat up and down the river. He is in such demand that hiring him is basically impossible. I didn't hire him, I ordered him to serve me first and compensated him for his lost work. Algeria was something like 300 miles away, as near as I can convert the units of measurement anyway. Our trip would take 10 hours, which was quite fast, I presumed. Seer certainly seemed to think so as they were cowering in the back. It could be that they were afraid of the scale eaters though. I wasn't particularly bothered by it though, I didn't need them for anything right now. No, I was going to spend the travel time planning. I was using magic stylus to write out notes and ideas on some paper, trying to work out exactly how this should go. First, obviously, would be meeting the prince at one of the eastern border forts. The problem was that those forts were functional, which doesn't sound like a problem at first. However, I couldn't just greet a prince in some poor mud and rock room. It would set entirely the wrong message. No, I would have to bring luxuries and decorations with me to the fort. I made a note to prioritize rugs and tapestries, to cover the bare stone. And we would need food for the fort and the journey back to Algeria. Well, we could resupply in the towns. No, I'd have the supplies delivered from the towns while we were traveling. A prince would want fresh food. Admittedly, expecting fresh food while traveling in this era was a luxury, but that was exactly the point. I would also need soldiers. The desert tended to kill bandits, so our empire rarely had to worry about raids and the like, but it would be best to be careful. Maybe I could work the soldiers into it somehow. Honor guards. Yes, honor guards and saluting on parade. Showing off luxuries without also making a point about our army would be a mistake anyway. I barely noticed the beautiful sights on the way north. The green fields, the tended gardens, the statues and monuments, they were awe-inspiring sights. However, I had seen them before and didn't have time to care. Instead, I thought and planned and wrote. 10 hours later, I was committing my plans to memory with everything as a record. This meant that with a brief pause to think, I would be able to perfectly remember my plans even without my notes, which was far more useful than having to rely on my unorganized notes and writing. The harbor was lit well enough that I could not see the stars very well, which was a pity, because the night sky in a world without modern light pollution was an incredible sight to see, and the city's governor was waiting for me. He bowed as I came off the ship, giving the river master my thanks, and then Governor Amalek spoke. "Greetings, Princess Hemmer," he said with a smile. "Welcome back to the verdant city, Algeria. I am sure you are tired from your journey. Please come with me." And silence, I interrupted him with imperial decree, putting enough of a tune into my voice to activate inspiring voice and muse's inspiration as well. My command hit the people around me like a truck, or perhaps like a scale leader, and the night went quiet with even the insects going quiet at my command. I had used inspiring voice to cause fear, and muse's inspiration to share my frustration. I was known as perhaps the most relaxed and kind of the royal family, but while I usually didn't mind some of the slights sent my way as a result, nothing could risk this. Amalek had spoken first, and while he was noble and highly ranked, as much as such things were ranked, the system was less official and more a complex web of favors and influence. He was not supposed to speak first. Governor or not, I could have his tongue cut out for this. The political fallout would be catastrophic. My eldest brother, Rasharon's first prince, would probably have me assassinated, as he was the governor's backer. But I could do it, and Amalek's white eyes told me he knew that. To the soldiers and servants nearby, it seemed that I was silently considering the governor. In reality, I was using an interesting application I had found for loud and clear. The skill allowed me to project my voice so that my audience could hear me, and I had found that if I just barely whispered, so quietly that my lips did not even seem to move, and treated a single person as my audience, the skill could be used to whisper into their ear. Governor Amalek, do not mistake how I have acted before for how I could act. My powerful and great father, may he reign forever in the sun's glory, has given me a mission, one I believe in. In this, my words are his. Aid me, and this will make you wealthy beyond your imagination. Hamper me, and you will see just how terrifying I can truly be. Well, if father doesn't get to you first, you should hope it is me and not him. It is late, I said aloud, my voice as cold as the desert at night. My eldest brother has told me of your dedication to your city and the work you do. So I will assume, Governor, that the exhaustion of your effort caused your etiquette to lapse, and I will forgive you tonight. There was a collective sigh of relief from the soldiers and servants. Angry imperial princesses were not known for their moderation in assigning punishments. Just being nearby could be a death sentence for the lower classes. Although this was technically true, it actually almost never happened though. My sisters and I were actually not very likely to punish a crowd for the sins of one man, but some of our ancestors ended up being very memorable. I believe you were about to offer me a place in the city palace for the night. I moved to continue, reflecting that the etiquette codes in the empire need to be updated. I would very much like to rest. Tomorrow morning, when we break our fast, we shall talk of why I am here. There is much to discuss and much to do. Of course, Princess. Amalek stuttered and bowed again, motioning to his servant to help Ansir with my luggage. A palanquin was brought, and as a procession we headed to the city palace. The palanquin was open to the air, so for appearance's sake I was not able to yawn, despite desperately wanting to. Instead, I reflected on etiquette, and realized that I would need to find an expert to instruct me in hentai etiquette. I hoped it wasn't as complex as Rasharon's was. As a general rule, in most of my day-to-day situations, it was not particularly important who spoke first. If I approached a servant, they could ask me how they could help or what they could do for me. If I visited the scribes or priests, they could greet and welcome me. Hell, after this the governor would be fine to approach me and speak without waiting for me to acknowledge him. However, when an imperial prince or imperial princess visited a city, the governor was supposed to wait for them to speak first on the first meeting. Technically, the reason for this is that even if the governor governs the city, the imperial family owns it. When royalty visited, they were not guests in the governor's city, the governor was a guest in the royal city. The whole thing seemed idiotic to me, but it was what it was. We reached the palace, which looked like a box with the top slightly less wide than the base and the outer walls at a slight angle. Of course, I'm not really doing it justice. During the day, when you could see the carvings and the surrounding gardens and statuary, it was a sight to see. But I was tired, and it was night, so it is a fucking box. I was guided up to my room by a nervous servant and quickly found my way to bed and to sleep. Chapter 12. Morning came too soon. Over 30 years without coffee and I still miss it dearly. Not the taste, mind you. Black coffee to me is basically a punishment game, but I ran on caffeine and I would take it however I could get it. On the other hand, unlike my previous life, I didn't actually have to do much to get up. Ansir more or less hauled my mostly asleep form over to help me bathe and then to help me dress. I have to confess that when presented with the power and riches of an imperial princess, I wasn't the type of girl to live modestly. I somewhat felt bad about it, but on the other hand, I looked stunning. In particular, I had commissioned a few pieces of jewelry based on a certain theme, the Ouroboros. I don't actually remember much about the symbol, I just knew that it was the name for the symbol of two snakes devouring each other's tails. I had a couple of bracelets like that, with the eyes of one snake being rubies and the eyes of the other snake being onyx. The dark onyx represented Poti and the rubies represented me, although after I had it made I started worrying about what Poti, or who or whatever had set this system up, got out of it from me. Considering that I didn't really have a choice, I shelved that existential crisis for now and just enjoyed the bracelets. They didn't have anything like Ouroboros in this world. Not that I had seen so far anyway, so it sparked something of a minor trend after I had it made. The poor reputation of snakes and the somewhat sinister look of the Ouroboros stopped it from becoming very popular outside of certain priests, though. Which was fine by me, it allowed me to keep it to myself. I wore a pure white linen dress. There really wasn't any variety of clothing, but was practically draped in gold and jewels. I had gold bands woven into my hair again, that was simply a part of my daily routine, and reflected on the fact that gold was really damn heavy. I suppose it was easier to keep in shape when I more or less had weights attached to all my limbs. There were other pieces of my own design in my ensemble. In particular, anklets with small bells on them that would chime as I walked. I also had small bells woven into my hair and as earrings. This was, however, not a fashion choice but rather a practical point. My muse class was geared towards combining forms of art and expression, and I had evolved it in part from my musician class that involved the use of instruments. I could hardly carry around a harp with me, and I can't sing and use a flute at the same time, but bells counted as an instrument and could be small enough to pass for simple decorations. And of course, what was a dance? What was a song? Dancing, at the end of the day, was artistic movement. Who is to say that someone could not walk artfully? Who is to say I couldn't treat walking and turning corners as a dance? And singing? Artful vocalizations. If I tried to tread the line between singing my works and speaking them, who is to say that my speech wasn't a song? I had little reason to use my skills before now. What need have I to use imperial decree or inspiring voice? Even if someone was rude to me, in the end they would have to give me what I want. Such was the nature of power. Those beneath me had no choice and no recourse save and appeal to my family. Anyways, showing off my skills would just make my siblings more wary of me. Now though, I had work to do. Once I was sufficiently awake, I was guided to breakfast with the governor. My bells rang with every step and my skills were perpetually active. If I had brought attendants of sufficient rank, I might have been having this meal with his family as well. As it was, as a point of etiquette to make sure I did not feel outnumbered or threatened, the governor and I ate alone together. The table set by the servants showed off the wealth of Algeria, the strength of its trade, and the bounty of its location. Sea-caught fish brought fresh from the harbor, fruits from the orchards that were watered by the delta, wine from the lands across the small sea. I would have enjoyed it much more if there was not business to discuss, but needs must. Governor, while I will deny this if I am ever asked, I do apologize for last night. I opened, knowing that a good relationship with the governor would make my life far easier. As you well know from our former meetings and my reputation, I do not care much for propriety or slights. I prefer to be relaxed and casual with those around me whenever I can, and from that I am sure you can understand that this is a time when I can't. You need not apologize to me, Princess. The governor bows his head slightly. I was in the wrong, but I will accept your apology and thank you for offering it. From our conversation last night I am quite interested to hear what you have to say. I gave a bright smile at that, leaning forward in a way that just so happened to cause the bells in my hair to chime. It should be easy to sell this Amalek, given the gains he stood to make. I am sure you have heard of my arguments for peace with the Hentai Empire. I took a sip of wine, letting him speculate for a few seconds with just that piece of information before going on. My great father has agreed, may he reign in the sun's glory. As the governor of a port city, as a governor of the port city at the entrance to Sharanan, I don't think I have to tell you what that might mean. I could practically see the greed in his eyes. A real peace with the Hentais? Trade would increase massively between our empires. Goods that we have never seen before will flow through Algeria and Al-Malik will be able to pocket a slice of all of it. It was certainly true that trade between Rasharan and the Hentai did occur already. If we were honest, and the royal family would never be on this, we depended on the Hentai. The southern reaches of our empire were thick with gold and copper, but tin? Not a single source in our entire empire. Obviously, you can't have bronze, an alloy of tin and copper, without tin, and that meant trade, and all of our tools for farming and building were made of bronze. There was a bit of a catch though. See, our weapons were made of bronze as well, and there was friction on our border with the Hentais. It didn't take a genius to figure out that our supply of tin was choked, we would lose the ability to repair or make weapons. We would be fighting with stone against armies of metal, and our armies would have trouble feeding themselves as we suddenly had trouble finding tools for our farmers. We could always trade through the civilization to the north. The fortress palaces across the sea were epicenters of commerce and industry, but that was ultimately a lot more distance to go and far more costly. Consistent direct trade would be far better for our pocketbooks, and there were a number of goods that were difficult to get second-hand. Like monster parts harvested from the chasms of hell. And he has sent me to prepare the way for the first prince of the Hentais who will be visiting the capital Caire itself. I continued, I hope, in view of the profits our empire stands to make, that we can put last night behind us and look towards the future together. Governor Al-Malik snapped out of whatever daydream of wealth he was having, suspicion entering his eyes. The problem for him was that it sounded too good to be true. The fact that I had not been involved in politics before did not change the fact that I was an imperial princess and that my class was known for its plots and intrigues. I had just given him a glimpse of a huge pile of gold, and now he was wandering around it wondering what devious trap would spring when he reached his hand out to take it. Now to show him just a hint of a dagger. I was thinking that Alzaria would be host to a free trade district in the harbor, I said as I leaned back, my bells chiming again. Administered and garrisoned by imperial troops from care to guarantee your safety, of course. A special tax-free zone to facilitate trade between our empires. I think offering such a deal to the Hintais will be a wonderful gift and sign of our goodwill, no? Where of course, Al-Malik would only get the barest scraps from the trade that would go on. Oh, it would still be even more wealth in his pocket, but it wouldn't be but the smallest fraction of what he could have gotten, and now that he had seen the jackpot, he didn't want to settle for the chump change. It might seem odd to be essentially threatening someone who I wanted to work with me of their own will, but it was all part of the game. I had to have a knife to his throat in order for him to feel safe. Because if he could see the knife and bribe me to take it away, he wouldn't have to worry about a knife in the back in the dark. Unrelatedly, you know how much I try to avoid the politics of the court, I say with an obviously fake sigh of regret. Unfortunately, I worry that some of my more principled arguments may have ruffled the feathers of a few of my siblings. I was thinking that there might be a space in the Delta where I could take a long vacation from the court in the luxury of these green lands. You wouldn't happen to know a place like that, would you? And finally, the bribe he could offer me to pull the knife away. A way out of the bloodbath the court would erupt into as my father aged. Retiring to a countryside villa here in the Delta would be viewed as my surrender in this situation. My siblings would view this peace treaty as my move for power, which I suppose it could have been if I had secured support from the Hintais, and they would view this villa, which would put me squarely under the influence of my eldest brother, as an admission that I had overstepped myself and removed myself from power. Governor Al-Malik smiled, raising his cup to me as he said, I actually know quite a few places that you might find particularly pleasing. Truly, the Sharanan Delta is a place of wonder, as close to paradise as the gods will allow. Oh, but that raises a bit of a problem, I say in fake surprise at a fake realization. A free trade zone would be a magnet for pirates, and as an imperial princess I cannot be exposed to such barbarism. I suppose that I will have to propose the free trade zone after my vacation is over. Translated out of political side-speak, I had basically said, put me up in a nice villa somewhere and that free trade zone will never happen. True, the flower of Sharanan could never be exposed to such a thing. His smile widened. It is a shame, but after this, who would blame you for a vacation? A little delay won't matter at all. Indeed, I am glad to have found an understanding man like yourself, Governor Al-Malik, I said with a chime of bells. Now, let us discuss how we can make this happen. I had learned two things after finishing breakfast and beginning to plan with Al-Malik. First, he let out a few hints that my eldest brother had put him up to his show last night as a way to gauge my plans. In return, I intimated that I welcomed him passing the information on to my brother. If I played my cards right, my eldest brother would help keep me safe with the presumption that he had me in his back pocket if he needed me. I can't really see a reason why he would, but if he did, I was there. The second thing I learned was something I had known all the way back in my first life. But there is a difference between learning something in a textbook and experiencing it, worlds of difference in fact. I am being punny to prevent myself from shredding these very valuable maps to pieces, because they were less an accurate representation of the area and more of a vague set of guidelines. I had imagined, in the back of my head, that classes and skills would make up for the lack of technology in this sector. I was very wrong. Being a mapmaker or a cartographer helped you make maps, sure. But they actually had to go to the places and travel to make the maps, and between the desert and monsters that wasn't as easy as it sounded at first. Regardless, with the governor's backing, I had the resources I needed for the journey. Of course, the palace would reimburse him the cost of anything I needed, but there were things that could not be purchased outright. Namely, the support of the governor's staff. Probably anyway. I haven't actually tried bribing them. I would feel kind of awkward doing it. It was a lot less awkward taking a bribe than offering one, to me anyway. I would be going out with a caravan, visiting the 2 towns between Alzaria and the border fort and the border fort itself. It would be a week there and a week back, burning a third of my time away in the desert sun. Not to mention, I had to leave enough time to get back to the fort again to meet the prince, which was 8 days from Caire. If I did my math right, despite my head spinning from the maps, I would have 18 days in Caire to arrange everything on that end. I had to hope that would be enough. And your messengers can truly make the journey so fast? I ask skeptically, as we talk about the supply plan. I mean no offense, but surely they can't be such high level as to make the entire journey in a mere 2 days. Their levels are particularly high, Al-Malik responded with pride. Away from Shahrinan, messages can only travel by land, so they get plenty of practice. Additionally, for this I will have them supplied with stamina potions. Truly. Are you not worried they will simply run away with them and sell them? I was shocked. Stamina potions are worth many times their weight in gold. The ingredients for them could not be grown in Rasharan and they were supposedly very difficult to make. Trusting any single person, let alone one who could outrun anyone sent to pursue them, with such a treasure was madness. As much as I dislike the practice, I will have their families held hostage at the time, Al-Malik replied calmly, inadvertently reminding me that there were few problems that couldn't be solved by the application of violence and suffering. If they do their job, they will be well paid for their work. If not, try not to choose any messengers with marital problems, I managed to joke, if barely. As long as the messengers do their jobs, nothing bad will happen to anyone. Still, before I leave from Alzaria, allow me to meet with them. I have some skills which might help prevent any problems, although by the time the messengers are traveling the effect will not be terribly great. And, with so much depending on it, I would be amenable to loaning some of the army's chariots to make certain everyone stays in line. I finish, pained to say such a thing. I had originally planned to order some of our most powerful force, our charioteers, to be in the area as a deterrence to bandits. I would have to get father's permission, but a force of 50 was a paltry sum. If I asked nicely, he might give that much to me as a simple gift instead of a loan. However, the idea of them chasing down deserting messengers was making me feel sick. Ideally, however, with all of that to keep people in line, none of it would actually have to be used. Princess, I hesitate to ask, but have you ever traveled through the desert before? Al-Malik asked rather hesitantly. Yes, but never a journey like this. I answered, thinking of the uncomfortable day trips I had taken to various religious sites that were further away from Shahrinan. Why anyone would do anything away from the river, I could not fathom. Then you should take this, he said, handing me a jar of something. It will help prevent your skin from tanning and burning during your travels. Thank you, you are most kind. I accepted the sunscreen. Ansir probably had some. Actually, the lotion they applied to me after the bath probably included this in it. It would explain a lot about why my skin was slightly lighter than most peasants. It wouldn't do for them to realize that the blood of the gods could get burned by the representative of Emir after all. I would not, of course, be using the governor's gift. For all I knew, it was an addictive drug of some kind. It wouldn't be the first time someone had given a cosmetic gift with such a trap in it in the court, and I might work with Al-Malik, but I would never be able to completely trust him. He was the kind of man who would always want more insurance in addition to more wealth and power. For now though, I was heading out into the desert to visit the villages on the way to the fort. Chapter 13. Traveling in the desert turned out to be exceptionally unpleasant, and it was far worse when traveling with a caravan. For me, anyway, I am sure it made sense for people who couldn't afford a chariot and driver, which was most everyone except high-ranking nobles and priests. If we had to travel by donkey, I might have gone mad before we made it to the first village, but thankfully we were able to use mules which were much faster. Compared to donkeys, anyway. I could have probably made it to my destination faster on foot if it wasn't a desert. Of course, I would need to carry water with me if I was on foot, and that would slow me down, and I obviously wouldn't be able to carry food or goods with me as well. Hence, the mules. In a lot of ways, it put into perspective just how much the desert limited the size of our empire. A lot of the land was simply so inhospitable that despite our power and wealth, we could barely reach a couple 100 miles away from Sheranan. The river that we lived on was our lifeblood, away from which the sheer brutality of the sands would leave nothing but bleached bones. Each leg of this trip was around 60 miles in length. Our caravan would be moving around 30 miles a day, and that was with the skills of our caravan leader. Traveling a few miles an hour on the back of a smelly animal with nothing to look at but open was mind-numbing. I swore that, after this business with the peace treaty was done, I would have a road built and carriages invented if it was the last thing I did. I spent most of my time singing, and lamenting the fact that I lacked a skill that would help us move faster. My only consolation was that I could try and use this as a way to test some of my theories about skills. I currently believed that every class had a list of skills that they could obtain, and the higher the class level, the more powerful and interesting skills would be available. That part was somewhat of an obvious point, but it was the basis for the next part of my theory. If there was a list of skills that someone could get, what decided what they would get? My observation, which is to say, my interrogations of servants and laborers, was that the largest basis for obtaining a skill was whether or not you needed it. If you were a warrior having trouble staying alive and it was reasonably certain that your next real battle would kill you, you would be far more likely to gain a defensive skill in training. How much you wanted a skill and how much you tried to obtain a skill were lesser factors, but they were also factors. If you had no real need, then the next most important factor was how much you tried or trained to get a certain skill. Of course, my data was contaminated by the fact that few people tried or trained for skills that they didn't want. Nevertheless, I certainly needed to reach my destinations on time. Speed was imperative, especially because the faster we moved the more time I would have to prepare each village. I also wanted, desperately, to have this end faster. Which only left training, which I am fairly sure my singing counted as. If I did level up, I would expect to get a skill that would make this ordeal more tolerable. At least my singing probably made this trip more tolerable for the people I was traveling with, and it was a lot of people. First, there was myself, but I was an imperial princess, and so I needed both servants and soldiers to guard me, and there was the caravan guide, who had a couple of servants and hired guards with him. I was bringing riches with me, in part to pay the villagers and in part to begin the process of decorating for the Hentai First Prince's visit. I wasn't going to carry the gold myself, which meant more mules, and more mules meant more servants to take care of them. Then we needed to have more guards to protect the treasure and watch over the servants to prevent theft, and more soldiers to watch over the guards. And all of these people have to eat and drink, which means more mules and even more servants. Camping out in the desert was at least tolerable. Cold, yes, but I had blankets and a tent. I can always add more layers if I am cold, but there is only so much an imperial princess can remove in the heat. It is a mark of slaves to go about naked, and even then it is only the men usually. Not that we had nearly as many slaves as I expected, but that was an effort for another time. The food available for dinner and breakfast the next day only strengthened my conviction that my decision to plan for messengers and couriers to meet and supply us while we traveled was a good idea. Not that it was particularly poor, but it was basically just bread and salted meat. And by salted meat I meant jerky, because anything that could spoil would spoil in the heat. So to fulfill Father's request, and coincidentally add to my own comfort, I was going to make even the traveling luxurious for the visiting prince. I had the map maker I dragged along mark the position of our overnight camp on the maps. I would have laborers brought out to construct some small structures. Rooms for the upper ranks to sleep in, a dining area, and most importantly, latrines. Plus, they could raise some poles that linen could be stretched between to make an impromptu structure if need be. Actually, as I think about it, having a way station like this built might just be a good idea in general. Another thought to put in my back pocket for later. I had messengers relay my orders back to Alexandria. I wasn't going to wait until I returned to the city to get this started. One of the flaws in Rasharan as an empire was that the backbone of our basically everything, was laborers. Builders and masons were skilled positions that we had far fewer of than one might initially imagine. Not that we didn't have a lot of them, but they spent more time doing detailed work than anything as mundane as constructing a stone room in the middle of nowhere. Back on Earth, this probably wouldn't be all that important in the grand scheme of things. It would be a waste to have a trained, educated, and skilled worker doing a job like hauling stone that an uneducated peasant could do just as easily. In this world though, skills were a thing, and a builder or mason with a leader class or a consolidation of leader and one or both of the other two leading a team composed of builders could set up a basic structure in less than a day. Laborers would take a much longer time. Although, compared to an Earth civilization with roughly the same technology and in a similar location, they were still incredibly impressive. Much of the reason that it wouldn't make much of a difference if the workers on Earth were skilled or unskilled for a project like this is that the project simply wouldn't be possible in the time frame I desired. I would probably be just making it Alexandria now if it weren't for classes and skills. Instead, I was entering the first village. Nader was a salt mine, which meant a couple of things. First, an absurd amount of wealth was produced here. Salt was an incredibly important commodity and was worth its weight in gold in some places. It had surprised me to learn that the more educated people I had met were aware that salt was necessary to survive, especially in an environment like Rasharan where the heat caused people to dehydrate quickly. Salt was, in a quite literal sense, life. But it was also death, because the second thing about Nader was that it was a place where slaves went to die. Rasharan didn't have many slaves compared to its population, but you would never know it here. Nader was almost entirely made of slaves, overseers, and taskmasters and was, essentially, a bunch of huts in a pit. Salt mining, something I had never even thought about on Earth where I was more worried about having too much sodium, was deadly. It carried all the risks generally associated with mining but added extreme dehydration to the mix because the salt would suck the water right out of the miners. Not to mention that the Rasharan desert was hot as hell and that the slaves were poorly treated in general. After meeting with the head overseer, however, I decided that it had to change partially, at least. Ideally, there wouldn't be slaves or slaves of any kind, but I simply lacked the power to do such a thing. Worse still, from the view up above, when considering the empire, it was somewhat hard to justify improving things in a place like Nader. People died in Nader all the time, but if there was somehow a shortfall in salt, people would die all over. Regardless, some changes did have to occur. Nader was close to the border and we had a history of skirmishes with the Hentais, which meant that a portion of the slaves here were Hentai soldiers captured in battle or maybe even civilians that were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It would be a poorer start to our peace for them to see their people enslaved barely 100 miles past the border. Especially not when the area itself was also incredibly valuable commercially and strategically. And so, I want you to make certain all Hentais in the mine survive until we pass through here, I was saying to the head overseer over a cup of wine. More than that, treat them well. I don't want to see starving or scarred men when we pass through and I free them as a gift. Your Highness, the head overseer wore almost as much jewelry as I did and it jingled softly as he set his cup down. A significant portion of the workers here are captured Hentai soldiers or similar classes. It isn't like they lose their levels in soldier or whatever else they have when they take up the slave class. For all the trouble they could cause if they revolt, these men are also our best workers. There hasn't been any skirmish of significance in weeks. The soldiers are still alive because they are far hardier than some peasants sold into slavery by their parents. And you worry that salt production would suffer, I sigh, knowing that this problem would have to be addressed and trying to think quickly. Thankfully, my travel had given me an idea, one so simple I had to wonder why it had yet to be implemented. I am uncertain that this would solve the fact that there would be an immediate dip in production. I speak slowly, choosing my words carefully and constructing my arguments in my head. But my own studies and education have led me to some interesting ideas for how to apply the singer and musician classes. I believe that, with the correct stimulus, many of them could gain skills that increase strength and restore energy to those who listen. A single singer might be able to improve the efficiency of the entire mine, if everyone can hear him. Perhaps that is so, Your Highness, he agrees readily as a slave tops off his wine. Yet ideas that could work in the future really do nothing to solve the issue before us now. A more practical solution would be to simply keep the slaves out of sight. But then I couldn't get the goodwill from the first prince by freeing his people for him, which I felt would be a great bonus to the start of negotiations. Of course, on the other hand, the soldiers could be a part of those negotiations. A more acceptable proposal might be to offer to return the soldiers in exchange for other slaves. There would be less of a hit to the salt production, but I would also be not nearly in as good a spot with the peace treaty than if I simply freed them at no cost. It would also require me to stomach being a more direct participant in the trade of slaves. It already left a bitter taste in my mouth that I had to leave any slavery alone, but actually being part of the trade would turn my stomach. I don't think I could do it as what I wish I could say, but salt was life and compromising the freedom of a few to aid in a peace between two large civilizations was a trade I would take if I had to. I would hate myself and the world as I did it, but I would do it. Still, I desperately considered what options I might have. Singers and musicians were not an option for now, and it wasn't like there were any other classes that had skills. By Pody, I am a fool. The answer was obvious, even if it was expensive and I was an imperial princess or a Sharon. If there was one thing I did not lack, it was gold. I was wealthy beyond the dreams of most people, and that kind of wealth could move mountains. Or at least get someone to travel to a salt mining town for a while, anyway. I have already sent to Algeria to build a waypoint between here and the city. I gave a victorious smile. It would be little trouble to send for additional masons. Salt is essentially stone, yes? Their skills can make up for the loss of slaves until more can be brought north. That would be costly. The head overseer mulled the offer over. If your highness is truly willing to pay for such a thing, it might be enough to shift the balance. I will also have a quarry master sent for, I continued, thinking of how to improve further. They will not likely be able to stay long. Father's projects always require more stone, but unless I missed something when I checked, none here have that class. It would likely be a boon to your work here. I had used Scholar's Eye to check, and no one seemed to have the class. Although I certainly hadn't seen everyone and the skill was far from perfect, so I could be wrong about that. It did allow me to see that the head overseer also had the warrior and merchant classes though, which was something. It was rarer for people to accumulate too many classes, and so I thought it unlikely that a class like Quarry Master had evaded my sight. Unfortunately, in all likelihood I am too high level to be able to benefit much from another class. I simply would not be able to level it much. The man shrugged, but I will certainly try, and production will likely be boosted while he's here. Still, the cost. Are you sure you wish to do this, Your Highness? Yes, I am. I was glad to have found a solution that involved freeing people instead of trading them, have the time men taken care of. I don't care if they still work, but before our scheduled arrival with the prince I want them to have bathed the day before. Lighten their work until then, feed them well and forbid the other overseers from beating them. One more problem solved, a seemingly infinite amount left to go. Chapter 14. Thus, I believe my research has shown that where classes overlap they are harder to gain or grow. A laborer will have difficulty gaining the farmer class just by working on a farm, because any menial labor will contribute far more to her laborer class than her possible farmer class. Furthermore, when a person has two classes and performs an action that can qualify for both classes, for example, a soldier who also has the leader class giving orders to a squad of soldiers, the growth will be split between the two classes, weighted towards the one most suited for the task. My conjecture is that this is the reason for the rarity of class consolidation, but I also believe it implies that any two classes that do overlap can consolidate into one. Investigating the process has proven difficult given the time involved in training to provoke a class consolidation, but it does continue. An excerpt from Second Treatise on the System as translated by Dr. A. J. Heimler. Believed to have been written by Princess Hemtra of Rasharan 2,000 years before descent. The second village was just a village, only noteworthy for being built around an oasis having more fortifications and storage than most villages of the same size. It served as a supply depot and fallback point for forts at the border and was far more military than civilian. In fact, it seemed that many of the soldiers at the fort had their families live here. I, personally, had very little opinion on the place. As far as I could tell, nothing of importance was produced here. The spring gave the oasis water, but the soil was more sand than dirt, so it was not farmed. There was plant life, but it was all hardy desert plants that could survive even in the sandy soil. There weren't rocks to quarry, clay to make pottery with, wood worth chopping, or basically anything else. Actually, on consideration, I suppose it is a noteworthy feature. I decided this really wasn't even a village, it was just a depot where some families of the soldiers happened to live. I would have to import servants here. The population was not up to the challenge of hosting the envoy even if I provided the food and decoration. The place certainly needed decoration though. Construction throughout Rasharan primarily only used two materials, stone and mud brick. Stone was expensive, and used exclusively by the upper classes. Mud brick, by contrast, was very literally dirt cheap, and was used to construct most of the cities in the empire. It was this cheap because it could be made by mixing mud and straw husks and then packing it down, so laborers could produce it all along Sharanan. Now despite what you might expect from the name, mud brick could look good. Even the palace complex wasn't entirely made from stone, it was actually mostly mud brick produced and constructed with care. The thing is, a lot of mud brick was not produced or constructed with any kind of care and that was on display here. The village named Mylid, which amused me personally because the way it was pronounced made it sound like me old in English and made me think at any time one of the people around me was going to say me old dog was a good dog and we've been in this here town since forever or something. I think the sun is getting to me, was not constructed with any particular care. The name of the village literally meant Tower Depot, and that was all it was, so no one had ever bothered to make it look impressive. The buildings were asymmetrical and bumpy, looking rough even from a distance. A lot of the bricks were oddly shaped or of random sizes, and there was no effort made to paint or decorate them. Neither of those were things I had time to do probably. Instead, I would just have tapestries and banners brought in and hang them everywhere as decoration. It wouldn't hide the mess perfectly, but I think it will look impressive enough that the ugliness of the buildings will be overlooked. Considering what I had seen at Mylid, I had expected the border fort itself to be just as much of a wreck, and I had expected that I would need to order similar preparations there as well. With what I had already planned for, I had even started thinking that I would end up spending more on cloth than I would on metal decorations. However, after leaving Mylid and enduring another desert trek, I was surprised to find that the border fort was actually very impressive. The outer wall was quarried stone and the inner structures were made of well-made mud brick, so you could hardly even tell the difference. The outer wall even had casting stones. Rather than paint, the walls had been covered in limestone casing stones that had been highly polished to be smooth and bright, making the outer wall shine a pure white in the sun. It was a very impressive effect, and I personally wondered if it was also a defensive tactic. I found it hard to look at the fort as we approached it because it was so bright. When we arrived, I met with the fort's commander. To my surprise, the fort would require far less preparation than either village. It was easy for me to forget, but our soldiers were a favorite class in our empire. While power was very much centralized with father, there were nobles, although very few had the noble class. I wasn't sure why that was yet, but I would like to find out. More relevantly, inheritance among the noble class was decided by primogeniture, which basically meant that the first son inherited everything. Second sons would often join the military as a result, either hoping to be rewarded with plunder and land for service or to rise in the rank and gain power that way. From my vantage point as an imperial princess, there was very little difference between a servant and a soldier. Realistically though, soldiers were part of the upper crust of society with status equal to scribes. As a result, there was far more wealth here than I had expected. The commander was a third son from a relatively powerful family in the south of the empire, and so he was able to arrange a welcome without needing much of my input so long as I provided the resources for him to do so. I was perfectly fine putting my trust in him because success here would be a strong boost to his career, and he would also know that if the peace failed because of him I would bury him even if I had to beg my brother to do it. With this, the first leg of the journey was accounted for. Now I just had to travel all the way back and arrange the rest. At the very least once I got back I would be able to take a proper bath and have a proper meal. *****. 1 week later, I was arriving back in Alexandria. I had gained, over the past 2 weeks, an appreciation for the amount of effort that must have gone into exploring and traveling through the lands in ancient times. If it was this uncomfortable for me, I can do nothing but pity the people who have to travel without the luxuries I have. It also made me appreciate George Lucas's writing from more than 30 years ago and 2 worlds away where I had watched the prequels. Because after that trip, I could fully understand devoting time in a multi-million-dollar movie in a beloved franchise to complaining about sound. Fuck sound. Again, Governor Al-Malik came to greet me, and this time he followed proper etiquette and allowed me to speak first. Governor Al-Malik, I smiled in greeting. On my return from the border I encountered your workers already constructing the way stations I had asked for. I appreciate the prompt effort, you have done well. He bowed in return, thanking me for the praise and offering me a chariot back to his palace. I gladly accepted this of course, because while I cannot say I hated mules, I certainly did not want to spend more time than I needed to on them. The temptation of a real bath was also a siren call and I simply could not resist. I probably should have, or at least given it some thought, because I and Seer were back with the rest of the caravan. While I certainly could use the servants and attendants provided by the governor, those 2 were my personal attendants and their skills reflected that. They not only had skills that helped them do things faster, but also ones that helped them do things better. It honestly made me feel like I was a poor maid in my previous life, although the research I had done, before father shut it down, had given me a little insight into that. After all, a battle maid was both a fighter and a servant, so it was best at things that involved both but only okay at things that were purely one or the other. The system was a bit different in that world, but I believed that the basic concept applied even in a world that only allowed 1 class per person. No, but thank you though, I waved the attendants away. I will wait for my own attendants, the skills they have honestly make it worth the wait. As you with, Flower Princess. The attendant bowed and was about to leave before I stopped her. Flower Princess. I asked curiously, why did you call me that? The woman's eyes widened, and she immediately flung herself to the floor, apologizing profusely. Forgiveness, Princess Hammer. She cried out in panic, I did not mean to offend you. Oh stand up, I rolled my eyes, having seen more than one scene like this. You haven't offended me at all. I am just curious why you called me Flower Princess. Many call you the Flower of Sharon, Princess, she said, only getting to her feet when I threatened to pull her up myself if she didn't. Rumors of your beauty had always circulated, but after your visit and the people saw you. Those who say you agreed that your beauty was like a precious flower grown by Sharon. Now that I think about it, didn't the governor call me by the title when I first showed up? I am not sure what to think about this. On one hand, it is incredibly flattering, but on the other hand it is also creepy to think that some old man was calling me a flower. Either way, this was just a consequence of my classes. Imperial Princess primarily raised charisma and willpower, while Muse, as a consolidated class, raised my charisma massively. I had over 200 charisma, and when you add that to the effort my personal attendants put into my appearance. Calling me that doesn't bother me, that was mostly true, I think. It just surprised me, that is all. You may go now, thank you for the explanation. Even using my skills, she was still nervous and fled from the room as soon as I gave my permission for her to go. I decided that what she said wasn't really important. I wouldn't be surprised if all of my siblings who were noticeable had titles or nicknames of some kind. Gaining the classes that I had originally consolidated into Muse had brought me into contact with parts of the population, and people had certainly noticed me when we left Alzaria and returned. I and Cyr arrived while I was thinking, and they began the preparations for my bath. I let out a very happy sigh as I slipped in. I was washing my hair, just like sunscreen. I was originally surprised that shampoo already existed, and even performing a scalp massage as well. Cyr, meanwhile, flitted around the room preparing my outfit, which was more difficult than you would think it to be considering the only clothing I wore was a white linen dress every day, arranging the jewelry I would be wearing. Maybe I should have a circlet with the Ouroboros theme made? Have you ever heard me called the Flower of Sharon? I asked, as she continued to wash my hair. I have Princess Hemmer, I replied as she began to rinse my hair. It is an appellation you deserve, to be sure. Perhaps, but I certainly wouldn't without the help of you and Cyr. I leaned forward for her to wash my back. Your skills and skill in applying my makeup and dressing me every day. I really appreciate the effort, you too. There was a pause at that. I think I had surprised her. Admittedly, she knew that I knew she sold information on me to my siblings, which some might think would make me dislike I. Realistically though, I was the 17th child of father. My older siblings had been around for quite a while before I was born. By the time I reached a reasonable age to begin having my own attendants, basically everyone was on the payroll of my siblings. But since I wasn't hiding anything, I didn't care about that. So why shouldn't I thank them for doing such a good job? Honestly, I didn't do it often enough. I really had gotten used to being an imperial princess, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that. It was basic courtesy in my original life to thank people for doing things for me, and my second life required me to have perfect etiquette at all times. In this life though, I used my status like a sledgehammer and expected people to obey me. It made me wonder how much my environment had to do with my behavior. But I shook those thoughts off as I was dried and dressed. Despite how much I wish there was after riding on a mule for 2 weeks, there was not time for the massage right now. I had still more arrangements to make, although I feel it was safe to say that the hardest part of my preparation was done. Not that the next part was easy. Unfortunately, our shipbuilding technique was rather lacking. Classes made up for a lot obviously, the River Master was proof of that. However, Sharon did not have massive ships or barges. It was, I believe, a result that is obvious when you consider the resource constraints our empire worked under. Wood was a precious thing in the desert. For 2 lives, I had lived surrounded by wooden objects and never thought about them much. In this life, I was wealthy beyond compare and royal, but I would have difficulty getting even a fraction of the wood I used to take for granted. For the trip downriver with the first prince, I had no intention to rush. Along Sharon you could see some of our greatest works, and the trip was the most beautiful sight in our empire. So I wanted to show it off with a slow pleasure cruise that could handle Prince and the people who accompanied him as well as myself and other Sharon elite. The elite wouldn't actually stay on the ship, but visited from the various cities we passed. However, I could not delay too much bringing the first prince to meet father, so the ship would have to have a place suitable for sleeping. While the ship would travel slowly, it would also travel constantly, without stopping at night. It didn't take a genius to realize that 6 weeks were not enough time to build what I wanted. It possibly wasn't long enough to even gather the raw materials. So I would have to cheat. I would have multiple smaller barges lashed together and a platform constructed on them, with structures built on top of that. Wood would be used sparingly in construction, with much of the material being used being woven reeds. I stopped by the docks to make certain construction would begin on time, while also sending for the river master to be prepared to bring me back to the capital tomorrow morning. I would have dinner with the governor tonight and be eating dinner in the royal palace tomorrow night. After that, well, even the governor was dropping hints that he knew what happened next, which I was taking as a subtle message from my eldest brother. The court has been astir since you left. The governor was showing off his wealth again, as both our plates featured Carol meat. Carol being a monster found far to the north that resembled a lion with 3 heads. Much like a Cerberus, which was also a thing but not particularly edible. No one had expected your request to be approved. Most everyone is scrambling around to see how this will change things. Most everyone is not everyone. I take a bite of the meal, savoring the meat and herb taste before continuing. I believe there are at least some who see as father doesn't understand the gains that we stand to make. To be sure, princess, but even if everyone is not scrambling, everyone is certainly making moves. The first prince has even decided to spearhead a few projects in the southern reaches, to reinforce the province and keep it in line. Truly. Well, I hope he will return to meet the hentai first prince. I had to work to prevent my eyes from narrowing. There was a lot to unpack there. I had hoped for the two of them to form a friendship. Ah, and there is a message from him to you as well, the governor said, motioning for a servant to bring it to me. I apologize for not mentioning it before, but the first prince asked me to wait until now. I wasn't listening to the governor anymore, instead I was scanning the message. It was short and to the point. The palace is yours on loan. Succeed and I will come north to join on your way out as guaranteed. It wasn't signed, but my eldest brother had a skill that allowed him to stamp his writing in a way that made it impossible to copy. The stamp was present, which means that this was the guaranteed words of my brother and that the pressure had just gone up immensely. My elder brother going south could mean a lot of things. It could mean that he expected to be able to relocate troops from the northeastern border to the south to help hold and pacify the territory. Alternatively, it could mean that he wanted to make sure that the fortifications in the south were strong enough to survive attack even if he removed troops from them to march north. It certainly meant that he didn't want to talk to me, and that was bad. He was worried, probably, that I had a skill that would allow me to control him somehow. I doubted it. His willpower would be quite high, but on the other hand, my charisma was very high as well. If he was worried about me, then that would mean I might be considered a threat to be eliminated, so I would have to allay his fears as soon as possible. Perhaps I should get a priest to send him a copy of my menu. That was personal and invasive, but so was getting stabbed, and I had already tried being stabbed once. The real question was, why was he worried? Because I could silence the governor with a single word and was manipulating him with my skills throughout our meetings. I thought to myself, realizing that I was a fool. I knew that the governor was reporting to my brother, so of course he would have told him. There was more to politics and intrigue than skill, and I had precious little skill because I had refused to participate. It seemed like a good idea at the time, I muttered under my breath as I sat back in my chair. Well, I had secured a palace for the hentai prince without having to beg, so silver linings I guess. Tobe continued. Thanks for listening.